I'm Grace Whitmore, 32 years old, illustrator, daughter, the one they never chose to see. In every family portrait, Charlotte glowed in the center while I stood at the edge, my smile thinner than theirs. Father's praise was always hers. Mother's sighs were always mine. I was present, but never celebrated. The breaking point came with her wedding invitation, gold embossed, perfect handwriting curling at the bottom. Can't wait to see you, Grace. That single line cut deeper than years of silence. It wasn't an invitation. It was a reminder of my place. To appear, to clap, and to fade. Ever been told you don't belong in your own family picture? Hit like if you've ever been overshadowed. Comment if you've ever been the one asked to shrink so someone else could shine. Because for me, it all started with that envelope on my desk, its weight heavier than any photograph, heavier than any smile I was forced to wear. Tonight, sitting alone in my Brooklyn apartment, I caught myself staring at the most recent holiday photo, then turned it face down. The walls around me were bright with taped sketches, watercolor spreads for children's books, whimsical foxes and dancing rabbits. But the paper frame with my family's picture was always heavy with shadows. The envelope had arrived that morning, embossed in gold. Charlotte's wedding invitation. My younger sister's handwriting curled at the bottom. Can't wait to see you, Grace. I ran my finger over her name. She had always written beautifully, as though even her letters attended finishing school. Mine, by contrast, was smudged graphite and brushstrokes, often messy with ink stains. I set the card down on the cluttered desk, next to a stack of picture book drafts. A small character I had drawn, a bear with a patched scarf, smiled up at me as if to reassure me. You belong somewhere, even if not in that photograph. I leaned back, letting my eyes drift toward the cracked paint of the ceiling. Childhood came rushing back in fragments. Edward's voice, my father's voice, barked through memories. Stand up straight, Grace. Don't slouch like that. Then Charlotte's report card on the fridge covered with gold stars. Mine, folded into a drawer. My attempts at watercolors brushed aside with the words, cute hobby, but it won't pay the bills. Margaret, my mother, perfected the art of smiling to the world while sighing at me in private. Why can't you be more like your sister? It was a refrain that still rang even when I picked up my paintbrush decades later. I rose, pacing the small apartment. Bookshelves sagged with art supplies. Mugs of cloudy water lined the windowsill. Brooklyn traffic hummed below, horns sharp, muffled by thin glass. It was a world I had built for myself, modest but mine. Every corner bore proof that I had chosen creation over compliance. Still, the wedding invitation lay heavy. It was another reminder of where I ranked in the Whitmore hierarchy, present, but not celebrated. I touched the invitation again, this time flipping it over to read the location. A hotel ballroom in Manhattan, chandeliers and champagne, everything my parents adored. My chest tightened. I knew what awaited me there. The comparisons, the forced smiles, the nods from distant relatives who would ask about Charlotte's corporate triumphs while ignoring my art entirely. My father would beam at Charlotte as though she were the sun itself. I would orbit in silence, a planet too dim to notice. But despite the ache, I told myself I would go. I whispered it aloud, as though promising the walls, I'll go. I'll sit quietly, clap at the right times, and leave before anyone notices me. It was safer that way. Less painful to remain a shadow than to be dragged into light only to be mocked. I crossed to the wooden chest at the corner and pulled out my portfolio. The leather edges were worn smooth by years of handling. I flipped through pages, watercolor illustrations of children smiling with balloons, soft lines of a hospital ward where kids with bald heads laughed at painted murals. These drawings had meaning even if my father could not see it. My throat tightened as I lingered on a sketch of a child hugging a fox. They had written me letters once, scribbled crayon. Thank yous pinned to my fridge now. But those voices were drowned out at every family gathering by the same relentless judgment. Still, I pressed my palm to the portfolio as if it were a living heart. Even if they don't see me, the children do. Silence stretched. For a moment, I thought maybe the night would pass without interruption. Then the phone on the desk rattled, shrill against the quiet. I reached for it, heart skipping. Margaret's clipped voice sliced through the line. Grace, don't wear anything flashy. Your father doesn't want you to embarrass us. At the Whitmore table, every word was a currency and mine was worthless. The long mahogany dining table gleamed under a chandelier trimmed with crystal, each reflection dancing against silverware polished so brightly it could have passed inspection at a jeweler's counter. Margaret had arranged the centerpiece herself, white lilies arched high, a subtle boast of refinement. Every detail of the evening radiated performance, a rehearsal dinner for the wedding itself, a showcase of family stature. I sat halfway down the table, the distance from the head seat, where Edward presided measured, not in inches, but in pride. The chairs around him filled quickly, Charlotte beside Ethan, her flawless smile rehearsed, her hand resting delicately on his. Father's voice dominated the room, the kind of booming baritone that demanded attention even when discussing something as banal as stock performance. Ethan leaned in attentively, answering questions about Wall Street markets as though reporting to a board of directors. "And you've already been promoted twice in just 3 years?" Edward's eyes shone. "That's exactly the kind of drive this family respects." His hand clapped against Ethan's shoulder, a gesture that might as well have been a coronation. Margaret's lips curved, proud and satisfied. Charlotte laughed lightly, and the sound was like glass tinkling, pleasant, rehearsed, designed for admiration. I picked at the edge of my napkin, wondering if anyone would notice if I slipped away. My plate held food arranged with precision, but the roast lamb might as well have been paper. Conversation moved like current, fast and smooth, and I remained a rock at its edge, watching. I wanted to say something, anything that reminded them I was still present. So I tried. I straightened, my voice soft at first but steady. "One of my children's books is being reprinted this year. The illustrations are being used in hospitals." I forced a smile, waiting for it to land. Edward didn't even pause. He shifted his gaze from Ethan to me, brows raised as though swatting a fly from his line of sight. "That's not real success," he said, each word clipped, final. "Cute, maybe, but the world runs on hard work and numbers, not doodles." The air seemed to drain from the room. My throat tightened, heat rising in my face. Margaret lifted her wineglass, pretending not to hear, though her eyes flickered sharp with warning, "Don't push back." Charlotte's hand shifted in her lap, but she didn't speak. Silence from her was its own kind of agreement. I dropped my eyes to my plate, willing the roast to swallow me whole. A laugh erupted from Edward, hearty and self-assured, as though nothing cruel had been spoken. He turned back to Ethan. "You'll learn, my boy. Respect isn't given, it's earned. That's why I admire Charlotte. She worked for it." I let his words fall like stones, each one bruising. They didn't understand that my drawings were lifelines for children who had nothing else to hold on to. To him, they were sketches without value. To me, they were voices. Yet voiceless is how I felt, sitting there with every reminder that I was ornamental at best. The lamb cooled, untouched. My hands stayed folded in my lap, nails pressing crescents into skin. I told myself to breathe, to remember I had survived this rhythm for years. But this time, the rehearsal dinner was not just another meal. It was the prologue to a public spectacle, where humiliation would not stop at the edge of the dining room. Edward leaned back, swirling his wine, the final sting leaving his lips. "At least, don't make us look foolish at the wedding." My chest ached as the words anchored like iron. The chandelier above seemed to shiver, its crystal drops refracting 100 tiny fragments of my shame. Ethan's gaze slid to me then, just for a moment. His expression was not the smirk I expected, not quite sympathy either. It lingered on the edge of something else curious, unreadable before he looked away. Brides shine. Sisters like me are told to fade. That thought clung to me as I stepped into the boutique, where soft jazz trickled from hidden speakers and racks of satin and silk gleamed beneath spotlights. The place smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume, the kind of air designed to remind you of your status, or in my case, your lack of it. I traced my fingers along a row of dresses in champagne, cream, and pastel colors that whispered invisible. Exactly what my mother had asked of me. The sales associate offered a polite smile, practiced and detached, before drifting toward women with larger rings and brighter credit cards. I didn't mind. I was here for something forgettable, something that would not draw attention. I pulled a muted gray dress from the rack, the fabric cool and lifeless in my hands. It was elegant, yes, but it also carried the dullness of a shadow. Mother would approve. Father would not notice. Charlotte would sparkle brighter by contrast. I carried the dress toward a mirror, holding it against myself. My reflection looked tired, a pale figure swallowed by the neutral fabric. The words from last night's dinner replayed Father's voice dismissing me, Ethan's unreadable glance. I forced a breath, willing myself not to crumble in front of a mirror designed to magnify every flaw. "Grace?" The voice startled me. I turned, blinking. Standing a few steps away was a woman with a cascade of auburn hair and eyes that widened with recognition. Sophia. My heart gave a jolt. We had studied together in art school, before life split our paths. She had gone into gallery work, while I retreated into the quiet solitude of children's books. God, it is you, she said, moving closer. I almost didn't recognize you, it's been years. Her smile was genuine, not polished for society. We embraced, the warmth unexpected in this cold, polished place. She pulled back, scanning me quickly, her gaze catching on the gray dress. That doesn't look like you, she said softly. It's for Charlotte's wedding, I admitted. Neutral. Blending in is easier. Sophia's brow furrowed. Blending in? Grace, your work never blended in. I still remember your final exhibition piece, those watercolor panels with the city skyline. You had something rare. I shook my head, embarrassed. That was a long time ago. I've kept busy with illustration projects, but nothing important. Her voice sharpened with energy. Not important? I've seen your name pop up in blogs about children's hospitals. You're doing meaningful work. And listen, there's an exhibition charity next month. We're curating artists who use their work for social impact. It's perfect for you. My chest tightened. The thought of stepping into a gallery again, of opening myself up to judgment, was terrifying. I glanced at the dress in my hands, lifeless against my chest. I don't know, Sophia. That's not really my world anymore. Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek card, pressing it into my palm. It should be your world. Call me. Let me introduce you to the director. This could be a turning point. I stared at the card, her name embossed in silver. The weight of it felt heavier than the dress. My throat caught. Maybe one day, I whispered, barely audible, as though afraid the walls might overhear my daring. Sophia squeezed my arm before leaving, her footsteps fading between aisles of shimmering gowns. I stood there a moment longer, staring at my reflection, my figure draped in gray, my fist clutching a card that shimmered brighter than any satin fabric. The phone in my purse buzzed. I pulled it free. A message glowed across the screen. Remember, don't try to stand out. At weddings, your seat shows your worth. Mine was next to the restrooms. The words echoed in my head the moment the usher handed me a card with Table 12 written in ornate script. I followed the line of tables, each glowing beneath crystal chandeliers, each filled with polished laughter and designer gowns. Near the center, Charlotte's table gleamed under a spotlight, her veil catching the shimmer like she was born of light itself. Father sat proud at her side, chest puffed, smile wide. My place, though, was tucked in a dim corner where waiters bustled in and out, with trays of champagne and clinking plates. I tried not to wince as I sat down. The seat creaked beneath me as though protesting the indignity. Across from me, two distant relatives glanced my way, then leaned together, whispering behind manicured hands. That's the older sister. I caught, their voices cutting like glass. Didn't she fail in her career? Something with children's drawings, wasn't it? They giggled lightly, sipped their champagne, and returned to their conversations about hedge funds and real estate. I folded my napkin carefully, as though neat edges could shield me. My dress, the muted gray I'd chosen to please Mother, felt heavier under the ballroom's glitter. Around me, guests raised crystal flutes and laughed at jokes about Teslas, summer homes, and stock surges. Their world spoke a language I had never been fluent in. When I glanced toward the main table, Mother's eyes brushed past me like I wasn't even there. She wore a navy gown, diamonds flashing at her throat, her smile perfectly practiced. Beside her, Father looked energized, shaking hands with Ethan's colleagues, laughing too loudly. Charlotte, radiant in lace, waved at a friend across the room, her joy effortless, her spotlight undeniable. I lifted my water glass, pressing it to my lips, though my throat was dry. Every sip tasted like surrender. The conversations around me grew louder, sharper, until my name surfaced again. Grace Whitmore. Oh yes, the one who still hasn't figured out her life. Another voice, older, rasped. Every family has one. Their laughter followed like smoke, curling, choking. The humiliation burned hotter than the champagne bubbles that sparkled in every glass but mine. My cheeks flushed, my chest tightened. I forced my lips into a smile, brittle and trembling. If I let it crack, the room would see. And that was worse, giving them the satisfaction of proof. The band shifted into a waltz, violins swelling as servers cleared plates. Guests leaned back, indulgent, golden in the candlelight. At my corner table, I felt like an afterthought, like a coat hung on the wrong rack. My hands fidgeted in my lap until I remembered Sophia's card, hidden in my purse. The weight of it steadied me, a reminder of a world outside this gilded cage. But the cage was tightening. A man in a tuxedo stepped onto the small stage, tapping the microphone. His voice rang clear across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smiling toward the head table, "Edward Whitmore will now deliver his speech. Words can wound deeper than knives, and my father was sharpening his." The ballroom hushed as Edward Whitmore stood at the center. Glass raised, microphone catching the light. He looked like a man born for stages, shoulders squared, smile calculated, voice trained to travel across a room without effort. The chandeliers seemed to bow toward him, gilding his arrogance. He began, of course, with Charlotte. "My daughter," he said, pausing for effect, "is the very definition of brilliance." Guests leaned in, nodding as if they were shareholders at a meeting. From valedictorian to Ivy League to this extraordinary partnership with Ethan, she has walked the straight road with grace, discipline, and vision. His hand extended toward Charlotte, who blushed under the applause, her veil glowing like a halo. Ethan squeezed her hand, pride etched across his face. Mother dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, though her mascara stayed perfectly intact. Around me, glasses clinked, a toast already in motion before the words were finished. I tried to steady my breathing, told myself to endure. It was Charlotte's night, not mine. Then the pivot came. I could feel it, like the shift of air before a storm. Father chuckled lightly, lowering his glass just enough to catch the room's expectant silence. "Now," he said, drawing out the word, "not every child finds the right path so quickly." A ripple moved through the tables. My spine stiffened. "Some," he continued, his eyes flicking toward me, "are still figuring things out." The words were a blade pressed against my skin. A polite laugh scattered across the room, brittle and sharp. Guests smiled, exchanging glances as though in on a private joke. "We love her, of course," Father added, the smirk tugging at his mouth. "But one can't help noticing, not everyone follows the straight road." Heat rushed to my face. My heart pounded so hard I thought the table might rattle with it. I fixed my eyes on the white tablecloth, tracing the embroidery with trembling fingers. If I lifted my gaze, I knew I would see them. The polite smiles, the smug grins, the pity. The humiliation pressed down like an iron hand, flattening my breath, crushing whatever scraps of dignity I still held. Charlotte's smile faltered. Ethan's brow furrowed briefly, though he said nothing. Mother kept her eyes fixed on her glass, lips curved in a frozen mask of approval. My father's voice rolled on, self-satisfied, filling the air with a poison wrapped in charm. Laughter soft, restrained, but undeniable spread through the room. I wanted to scream, to walk out, to vanish into the shadows of the hotel corridor. Instead, I forced my lips into a fragile curve, the kind that might pass for composure. Inside, I felt hollow, scraped clean. Father raised his glass higher, as though to crown his cruelty. "To Charlotte and Ethan," he concluded. "To success, to discipline, to a future built on solid foundations." His words landed like stones, heavy and deliberate. Applause swelled, carrying with it the echo of my own invisibility. I swallowed hard, willing the tears to stay hidden. My hand clenched around the stem of my water glass until my knuckles blanched. And then sharp, startling came the sound. A single, deliberate clap, cutting through the polite applause like a gunshot. Heads turned. The noise grew louder, measured, insistent. Richard Lane, Ethan's father, was rising from his chair. When laughter tried to bury me, one voice cut through the noise like thunder. The ballroom froze as the sharp clap reverberated across crystal and polished marble. Richard Lane, tall, silver-haired, a man whose presence seemed to command obedience, rose from his chair. The chatter died, and with it the laughter that moments ago had pierced me like needles. He stood with a patience that was more powerful than any anger, his measured movements drawing the gaze of every guest. My father's smile faltered, his hand tightening around his glass as if he'd just lost control of the script. Richard didn't rush. He allowed the silence to deepen, allowed curiosity to thicken into tension. Then his voice carried, smooth yet firm, like a judge addressing a courtroom. "I must say something," he began, eyes sweeping the room before landing squarely on my father. "Forgive the interruption, but I cannot remain silent." Murmurs rippled, guests leaning toward one another. A few looked at me with raised brows, eager for spectacle. My throat closed. I gripped the edge of my chair, caught between dread and the faintest flicker of hope. "I don't know Grace well," Richard continued, his tone respectful but steady. "But I did something her father apparently has not. I looked her up." A collective gasp cut through the air. I felt blood surge to my face, panic prickling under my skin. He lifted a hand slightly, commanding the room's attention with ease. My wife once gave me a children's book, he explained, beautifully illustrated, delicate, alive with warmth. I discovered it was her work. His gaze shifted toward me, and for the first time that evening I felt seen. I followed further. I read about the art she donates to children's hospitals, children fighting battles most of us cannot imagine. Her drawings have given those children laughter, hope, a reminder of joy in the bleakest of days. The air grew thick, the clinking glasses and shallow chuckles silenced. My father sat motionless, lips pressed in a hard line. Margaret's hand twitched toward his arm, as though to anchor him. But even she could not hide her discomfort. Richard leaned slightly forward, his voice resonant with quiet force. "And you call that lost?" His words fell heavy, each one a strike against the smug veneer of my father's performance. Guests shifted, uncomfortable, some looking directly at me with new eyes. A soft gasp slipped from Charlotte, her eyes darting between us. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but his attention was sharp, locked onto every syllable. "That," Richard said firmly, "is not failure. That is legacy." The ballroom erupted. Applause tentative at first, then swelling, genuine from pockets of guests who recognized the truth. A few clapped hesitantly, compelled by etiquette. Others looked down, ashamed of their earlier chuckles. For me, the sound was a strange tide, both exhilarating and terrifying. My chest tightened, tears threatening to break free, though I bit them back with all the strength I could muster. Across the room, my father lowered his glass, his expression hardening into stone. He sank into his chair without a word, color rising to his cheeks. For the first time in my life, Edward Whitmore was silent. I wanted to breathe, to let relief wash over me, but then I caught at his eyes. Cold, narrowed, furious. They locked on me across the candlelit table, colder than ice, sharper than any insult he had spoken aloud. And in that chilling glare, I understood. The applause was not the end of my humiliation, but the beginning of a battle I had never dared imagine. Applause fades fast. Shame lingers longer. The ballroom had erupted, but already the clapping had dwindled into scattered taps, the kind of polite noise people make to prove they are part of a moment without committing to its meaning. The violins resumed their melody, the servers returned with fresh champagne, and the machinery of the wedding rolled on as if nothing earth-shaking had happened. Yet inside me, everything was trembling. I sat rigid, hands clasped together in my lap, aware of every stolen glance, every whisper threaded with curiosity. A couple I didn't recognize drifted near my table. The woman smiled too brightly, her pearls catching the candlelight. "We had no idea you were an artist," she said, voice dipped in sugar, as though congratulating a child for drawing inside the lines. Her husband nodded, adding, "Hospitals, was it? That's touching." Their words were meant as kindness, but I heard the condescension lurking beneath. Still, I nodded politely, too tired to argue for dignity. They left before I could answer. Others came too, pausing briefly, offering comments that sounded more like confessions of guilt than genuine praise. "Your work must be meaningful. Children love colors, don't they? Such a sweet hobby." Each voice pricked at the bubble of validation Richard Lane's defense had given me, reminding me that applause might be loud, but it was never permanent. Then Charlotte appeared at my side, veil trailing like smoke, perfume soft and floral. Her smile was faint, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Grace," she whispered. Her eyes searched mine, filled with something that almost looked like regret. But before I could reply, before I could grasp her words as lifeline or lie, she was whisked away by Ethan's hand on her waist, her laugh ringing clear as she returned to her pedestal. I had no time to linger on it. Mother's hand clamped around my wrist, pulling me into the shadow of a column near the exit. Her eyes flashed, the warmth of champagne gone, replaced by steel. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she hissed. "Your father is humiliated, humiliated. That applause, don't think it means anything. People will forget by dessert." Her nails pressed into my skin, and I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to shout that I hadn't asked Richard to defend me, that I hadn't chosen this battlefield. But the words withered in my chest. Instead, I nodded, like I had as a child, trained to survive her disappointment by shrinking small. When she let go, I staggered back a step, my hands shaking. The ballroom blurred. lights and music melting together. My father had not spoken a word since sitting down, and that silence, it was heavier, crueler, more suffocating than his insults. His silence meant calculation. His silence meant something was being sharpened in the dark. I pressed trembling fingers against my clutch, searching for steadiness, when my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting another demand from Mother, but the name that lit the screen stopped me cold. Sophia. Her message glowed sharp as a flare in the night. "We need a lead artist for the charity exhibition. Are you in?" That morning, silence at the Whitmore table was sharper than any toast. The long mahogany dining table stretched before us like a battlefield disguised in linen and silver. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the crystal glasses and polished cutlery, but no one dared to bask in it. The clink of a spoon against porcelain rang out like a cannon shot, then was swallowed again by the suffocating quiet. The housekeeper moved about soundlessly, as if even her footsteps might ignite an explosion. I sat stiffly, my coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the plate in front of me. Scrambled eggs congealed slowly under the golden light, but I couldn't lift my fork. Across from me, Charlotte picked at her croissant, every bite smaller than the last. Her cheeks were pale, her wedding glow extinguished. Margaret sat regal at the head of the table, posture flawless, pearls gleaming, her disapproval as sharp as the butter knife she wielded. And Edward sat in stony silence at her side, newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched orange juice, eyes narrowed at nothing and at everything. It was Margaret who finally spoke. "Grace," she said, voice clipped, "your behavior last night was disgraceful. Do you realize how many of our guests were whispering? Do you even understand the position you put your father in?" My lips parted, but no sound came. I wanted to say that it wasn't me who had turned the spotlight cruelly upon my failures, that Richard Lane had chosen to speak because my father had chosen to wound. But the weight of Edward's silence pressed against my chest, suffocating any defense before it could take shape. Charlotte set down her croissant with trembling hands. "Mother, it wasn't Grace's fault," she murmured, eyes darting nervously between us. "Dad was the one who—" "Charlotte." Margaret's tone was enough to cut her off. "Do not excuse weakness," her gaze snapped back to me. "You should be grateful your sister's wedding wasn't ruined." The words burned hotter than coffee ever could. My throat ached with the need to defend myself. But Edward remained still, his knife poised above his plate, though he hadn't touched his food. Every second of his silence was a punishment, a reminder that his judgment would fall when I least expected. Then, without warning, he moved. The chair scraped harshly against the hardwood as he rose to his feet. His napkin, crumpled with deliberate violence, slammed onto the table with a crack that made Charlotte flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "Do not test me again." The words reverberated through the dining room, vibrating in my chest. He didn't look at me directly, but I felt the weight of his fury settle squarely on my shoulders. Then he turned and strode from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a sentence passed without trial. The silence that followed was worse than the one before. Margaret resumed eating with cold precision, as though nothing had occurred. Charlotte lowered her gaze, shame flickering across her features, and I realized then that I could not breathe inside these walls. Later, in the quiet of my childhood room, I opened the drawer where my portfolio lay. Sketches, drafts, illustrations, my life's work, dismissed as nothing. I stacked them carefully, slid them into my worn leather case, and zipped it closed, with hands steadier than I felt. I glanced once at the heavy curtains, the polished furniture, the photographs where my smile had always been smaller, dimmer. Then I carried my portfolio down the stairs, each step an act of defiance, and walked out of the Whitmore house for good. In my cramped studio, the world's cruelty couldn't reach me, but my art could reach them. The space smelled faintly of turpentine and ink, a perfume of persistence. Sunlight fought its way through the Brooklyn windows, casting fractured beams across canvases stacked in corners and sketches pinned haphazardly to the walls. Every inch of the room was alive with fragments of me unfinished stories in watercolor, half-sketched characters who looked out from the paper as if waiting to be given breath. Here, surrounded by color and mess, I felt untouchable, if only for a little while. Sophia leaned against the scarred wooden table, her heels tapping a rhythm of impatience. "Grace, you can't keep hesitating," she said, waving the glossy flyer for the charity exhibition. "This isn't just any show, it's the Children's Healing Arts Gala. Hundreds of eyes, real collectors, sponsors. You've already done the work. All you have to do is let them see it. My fingers traced the edge of a canvas where a fox peeked shyly from a forest of impossible blues. You make it sound simple, I murmured. But if I fail there, it won't just be my failure. I didn't finish. The image of my father's smirk, the ballroom laughter, still pressed against my chest like an old bruise. Two other artists, friends of Sophia's, wandered around the studio, pausing at different pieces. One, a tall man with paint-stained sleeves, bent closer to a series of whimsical cityscapes I'd done for a hospital mural. This, he said, almost to himself, this has soul. Kids must adore it. The other, a woman with streaks of purple in her hair, nodded eagerly. You've got something rare, Grace. Not just skill, heart. Their words sank into me like warm light after days of rain. For years I'd fought to believe that what I created mattered, that it wasn't just childish distraction or wasted effort. Hearing strangers, artists say it gave me something my father never could, validation without condition. Sophia crossed her arms, eyes sharp but kind. You've been surviving in the shadows long enough. This is your chance to step into the light, not for him, not for me, for yourself. She slid the participation form across the table, a pen balanced on top like a dare. I stared at it. My hand trembled as I reached out, the pen cool between my fingers. All the fear, all the whispers of my father's voice telling me I was nothing, swirled inside my chest. What if they were right? What if I failed here, in public, with no Richard Lane to rise and defend me? But then I thought of the children who clutched my books, of the way their eyes widened at a storybook world that let them forget their hospital rooms for a while. Even if my family never saw me, they did. They always had. I pressed the pen to the page and signed my name. A single line, shaky but final. The air seemed lighter afterward, as if the act itself had pried open a window. Sophia grinned, triumphant. Finally, she said, now we make sure they'll never forget your name. For the first time in years, I allowed a smile to linger on my lips. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a step towards something more than survival. The euphoria was fragile, though. When I returned to my desk, my laptop screen glowed with a new email notification. I clicked it open, expecting routine spam or a note from the exhibition committee. But as the subject line sharpened into focus, my breath caught. I wish to sponsor your project. Richard Lane. Sometimes the harshest critics are those who once dreamed what you now dare to do. The Whitmore mansion was silent when I crept back inside. I had forgotten a sketchbook, nothing monumental, just a battered notebook filled with half-finished illustrations I couldn't afford to lose. The house carried its own breath at night, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, the groan of old wood, and the whisper of curtains shifting against the windows. It felt less like a home and more like a museum built to preserve control. I moved quickly, hugging the banister as I climbed the stairs. My room was just as I'd left it, curtains drawn, bedspread taut, as if my presence had already been erased. I grabbed the sketchbook from the nightstand, but curiosity tugged me toward a door I had rarely dared to open. My father's study. The handle turned with a reluctant squeak. Inside, the air smelled of leather, cigar smoke, and dust, a man's domain, guarded as fiercely as his pride. The walls were lined with books on finance, politics, and strategy. But one shelf sagged with something different, albums and boxes tucked out of sight. I pulled one free, its leather cover cracked with age. When I opened it, my breath hitched. Inside were photographs, programs, even faded reviews. Edward Whitmore, not as the stern patriarch I knew, but as a young man standing beside canvases. His eyes in those pictures were alight, the way mine sometimes glowed when I lost myself in color. Exhibition pamphlets bore his name in bold type, announcing shows in small galleries I had never heard of. And then clippings, reviews sharp as knives. Derivative, ambitious but hollow, lacks heart. One by one, the words tore into him, the way his words now tore into me. I turned the pages slowly, the evidence mounting until the story was undeniable. He had tried. He had dared to put himself in the arena I now fought to survive in, and he had failed. A soft sound startled me. Margaret stood in the doorway, her silk robe cinched tightly, her face pale in the dim lamplight. "What are you doing in here?" she hissed. I snapped the album closed, guilt burning through me. I was just... She strode forward, snatched the album from my hands, and shoved it back onto the shelf. Her eyes darted toward the hall, as if Edward might materialize from the shadows at any moment. "You must never speak of this," she whispered fiercely. "Not to him, not to anyone. He will never forgive you." Her urgency was almost more frightening than his rage. I swallowed hard, staring at the albums she had tried to bury. So that's why, I breathed. He despises my art because it mirrors what he lost. He's not ashamed of me. He's afraid of me. The words felt dangerous, even whispered. They were a truth I wasn't sure I was meant to hold. Then a deeper shadow filled the doorway. Edward's frame loomed, his presence eclipsing the fragile courage I had just found. His voice was low, rough with something between fury and fear. You had no right to see that. He called my art worthless, but this time I didn't stay silent. The lamplight in Edward Whitmore's study bled across the polished wood, catching on the glass of framed certificates and awards that had nothing to do with color, with canvas, with imagination. The air was thick, heavy, and I could feel the weight of his stare burning through me as though the walls themselves demanded my retreat. But I didn't move. My fingers still tingled from the album I had dared to touch, the proof of a dream he had buried long ago. Edward's jaw was a carved stone mask. You had no right, he said, each word measured, coiled. No right to dig through what doesn't belong to you. I clutched my sketchbook to my chest, the one I had come back to retrieve. I wasn't digging. I just saw the truth. My voice trembled, but I forced it steady. You tried to live in the world I live in now. You failed. That's why you hate what I do. His eyes flared, and the control he so carefully maintained cracked. Stop this nonsense, he barked. You think your silly sketches mean anything? Children's drawings on flimsy paper? Stop pretending they'll save you from the real world. They will not buy you respect. They will not buy you worth. Something inside me snapped. For years I had swallowed his dismissals, tucked them deep where they festered. Tonight, the words clawed their way out. At least I didn't quit like you did. My voice rang against the shelves, louder than I had ever dared to be in his presence. His face darkened, the vein at his temple pulsing. He stepped closer, the lamplight carving cruel shadows across his features. You dare, he hissed. You dare to measure yourself against me. I built this family's name, this legacy. He jabbed a finger at my sketchbook. You scribble in obscurity, deluding yourself that anyone cares. Do you think applause at a wedding will last? Do you think some charity exhibit will make you immortal? It won't. It will eat you alive. My throat burned, but I refused to look away. Better to be eaten alive doing what I love than to rot safe in a prison of your own making. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretched taut like a string ready to snap. His hands trembled at his sides, fists clenching and unclenching, as if even his body couldn't contain the storm. And then he shouted, his voice cracking the stillness. If you fail, never call me your father again. The words slammed into me harder than any slap could. They echoed in my bones, cutting through marrow. For a moment, I felt myself falter small again, the forgotten daughter in the corner of every family portrait. But I couldn't let it end there. Not this time. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding, legs unsteady but propelled by something fiercer than fear. My voice dropped to a whisper, not trembling, but sharp, deliberate. Watch me prove you wrong. And with that, I stormed out, the sound of the door swinging wide behind me like the crack of a gavel, sealing the judgment between us. Every brushstroke now was a weapon aimed at his silence. The studio had never felt so alive. For years it had been a place of retreat, a sanctuary for unfinished canvases and half-hearted attempts at daring, where the hum of the city outside was louder than my own ambition. Now, it throbbed with the rhythm of purpose. Paint-stained dropcloths layered the floor, canvases leaned in defiant ranks against every wall, and the smell of turpentine mingled with the bitter sweetness of late-night coffee. This wasn't just a studio anymore, it was a war room. Sophia was everywhere at once, her dark curls bouncing as she paced, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, the press kits are going out tonight. Yes, the venue will be confirmed by tomorrow. She turned to me with a grin that carried the kind of fire I needed. Richard Lane just sent the transfer. The exhibition is fully funded. I froze, brush still dripping indigo onto the ragged edge of my canvas. Richard Lane, whose voice had thundered across the wedding hall, cutting through humiliation like a sword, was now the quiet force behind my stand. I thought of Edward's eyes narrowing, his contempt sharper than any blade, and something tightened in my chest. This wasn't just art anymore. It was rebellion. It was survival. Fellow artists drifted through the studio, carrying their own works but drawn, somehow, into the orbit of mine. They studied the sketches pinned to the wall, children's faces, dreamscapes, distorted silhouettes that seemed to hover over fragile figures. "These are raw," one whispered, awe softening the word. Another touched the edge of a canvas where the outline of a girl reached toward a sky that was half light, half storm. "People will feel this." Their belief was foreign to me. I'd lived too long in a world where every glance was measured, every achievement belittled. To hear validation not drenched in mockery felt almost dangerous. Night after night I painted. I poured everything I couldn't say into color. Anger became crimson streaks slashing across the surface. Sorrow was a wash of muted blues. Hope glimmered in tentative strokes of gold that refused to be drowned. My hands cramped, my eyes burned, but the momentum carried me forward. Each canvas was a confession, a testimony carved in pigment. Then came the piece I knew would stand at the center of it all. I worked alone, the others gone, Sophia asleep on the couch with her laptop still open. The lamplight cast long shadows across the room, and with each stroke, the figure grew. A girl sat on the floor, her mouth sealed in silence, her small hands clutching paper that disintegrated in her grip. Behind her loomed the shadow of a man, indistinct but towering, his shape blotting out the light. I painted until my arm ached, until the silence of my childhood screamed onto the canvas. When I finally stepped back, trembling, the painting seemed to breathe on its own. Sophia woke, rubbing her eyes, and gasped when she saw it. "Grace, it's devastating, and it's perfect." Her words filled me, but fear gnawed at the edges. Edward's voice still echoed in my ears. "If you fail, never call me your father again." He had built walls of silence around his shame. Now I was tearing them down with color. The days blurred, the exhibition taking shape. Emails from Richard Lane trickled in, polite and efficient, every line confirming his belief in the project. He never once asked for credit or publicity. That quiet confidence only sharpened my determination. But victory never comes without shadows. It was past midnight when my phone buzzed on the paint-streaked table. I expected Sophia with another logistical update, or perhaps one of the artists checking in. The message was anonymous, the number unlisted. Just a single sentence glared back at me in black and white. "Cancel this show or you'll regret it." The sister I envied became the ally I never expected. The cafe was a dim-lit refuge from the relentless hum of Manhattan. Espresso machines hissed like tired sighs, and clinking cups filled the silence between conversations. I sat tucked into the corner booth, fingers wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, waiting for Charlotte. Part of me expected her not to come at all. She had always been the Whitmore family jewel, polished, prized, untouchable. I braced myself for another polite dismissal, another reminder of where I stood. But when she arrived, she didn't walk like the perfect bride-to-be I'd always known. Her shoulders sloped forward, her smile was brittle. Charlotte slid into the seat opposite me, lowered her sunglasses, and for once, I saw exhaustion clouding her carefully constructed poise. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to meet," I said softly. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, voice almost breaking. She stirred her coffee, though she hadn't added sugar, a nervous habit I'd never seen before. "Grace, I have to say something. Something I should have said years ago." My chest tightened. I had spent my entire life competing with her without her ever noticing. Now here she was, fragile in a way that unsettled me. "I envied you," she blurted, her eyes darting up to mine, pleading for me to understand. "Not because of your art, or because father ignored you. I envied your freedom. You got to be invisible. I had to shine every single day, whether I wanted to or not." The words hit me like a strange, painful balm. Invisible. Freedom. Two things I'd never seen as blessings. To me, they had been curses etched into every childhood memory. Yet to Charlotte, they looked like escape routes she'd never been allowed to take. She went on, voice trembling. "He demanded perfection. The right friends, the right grades, the right fiancé. Do you know how suffocating it is to be the family's masterpiece? Knowing one crack will shatter the illusion? I didn't even choose Ethan. Father did." She paused, swallowed hard. And I didn't dare say no. I opened my mouth, but she reached into her leather bag before I could respond. From it, she pulled a slim envelope, worn at the edges. She slid it across the table, her manicured nails lingering on the flap. I hesitated, then pulled the papers free. They were old gallery reviews, brittle clippings with Edward Whitmore's name, printed proudly at the top until you read the critiques. Words like uninspired, derivative, and ambitious but lacking originality glared back at me in ink as sharp as knives. Behind the clippings were unpaid debt records from failed exhibitions, contracts terminated, galleries that had closed their doors on him. I felt the air rush out of me. This wasn't just a father who didn't understand art. This was a man who had tried and failed, who had buried his shame so deep he'd built his entire life on denying it. Charlotte leaned closer, whispering as though the truth itself might explode if spoken too loud. His cruelty isn't about you. It never was. He sees himself in your work, and he's terrified. Terrified you'll succeed where he collapsed. The cafe noise dimmed around us. My throat burned with unshed tears. Not just for myself, but for the years wasted on silence and shame that weren't mine to carry. For the first time, I saw Edward not as the omnipotent tyrant of my childhood, but as a man still bleeding from old wounds he had never admitted. I looked at Charlotte, at the sister who had stood beside me for years yet worlds apart. There was no triumph in her expression, no condescension, only weary determination. She pushed the documents toward me, her hand shaking slightly. "Use this," she said, her voice steady now. "It's time he faces the truth." For once, the spotlight wasn't theirs. It was mine. The gallery pulsed with a nervous kind of electricity, the kind that made the air feel alive before a storm. Chandeliers shimmered overhead, their light catching on the glossy varnish of canvases and polished marble floors. A sea of high society guests drifted from painting to painting, crystal flutes of champagne in their hands, their murmurs like an undercurrent rising beneath the music playing softly from a string quartet. But for once, they weren't murmuring about Charlotte's designer gown or Edward Whitmore's latest business triumph. They were whispering about me. My paintings hung in proud defiance along the gallery walls, each one a confession I had been too afraid to speak aloud. A child alone at a dinner table, a faceless father's shadow consuming her small frame, colors bleeding from hope into despair, then back into light. The critics bent forward to study them more closely, some scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Their words floated through the air like gifts I never expected to receive. Brilliant use of contrast, emotionally devastating, fearless. Sophia appeared at my side, radiant in a simple black dress, her eyes sparkling with vindication. "You hear them?" she whispered. "They see you, Grace. They really see you." I nodded, but my gaze drifted across the crowd to Richard Lane, standing with a cluster of patrons. He caught my eye, lifted his glass, and smiled in quiet encouragement. He had funded the exhibition, yes, but more than that he had believed in me when my own blood had not. Tonight, his presence was an anchor. Charlotte hovered just behind me, her hand lightly brushing my elbow. She hadn't dressed for attention tonight. Her pale dress was understated, almost muted, as though she wanted no part of the spotlight, and yet her loyalty burned brighter than anything she'd ever worn. She leaned close and whispered, "I'm proud of you." The words, so foreign coming from her lips, made my throat tighten. For a brief, shimmering moment, it felt like triumph. My heart lifted, not because I had silenced my father yet, but because I had finally spoken for myself. And then his voice cut across the gallery like a blade. "This," Edward declared, his tone sharp and carrying, "is not success. This is sentimentality paraded as art." The crowd froze. Conversations snapped off mid-word. Heads turned toward the tall, broad man who had once been the center of every Whitmore gathering. His face was a mask of disdain, his jaw rigid, his eyes gleaming with the fury of a man who felt his control slipping away. Margaret clutched his arm, whispering urgently, but he shook her off. He strode closer, his shoes striking the marble floor like gunshots. "Don't applaud mediocrity dressed up in tragedy. She paints her own wounds and calls it legacy. Is this what you people admire? Weakness smeared across a canvas?" A wave of gasps broke through the room. Critics stiffened, patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared move. My pulse thundered in my ears, yet I didn't shrink. Not this time. Richard Lane started forward, but I lifted a hand to stop him. The silence grew heavy, suffocating, waiting for me to collapse as I always had before. But instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the slim folder Charlotte had given me. The brittle pages crackled as I held them up for all to see. Clippings of his failed exhibitions, scathing reviews, unpaid debts, all the ghosts of the career he'd buried. I turned slowly to face him, my voice calm but carrying. "Are you sure you want to compare our failures tonight?" The room inhaled as one, every guest leaning closer, every critic's pen poised. Edward's face blanched, his composure cracking like glass under pressure. And in that instant, I realized this was no longer just an exhibition. It was a reckoning. He wanted me to be invisible. Instead, I became undeniable. The gallery floor had fallen into a hush so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Reporters poised with pens, cameras tilted forward, patrons leaned in as though history were about to etch itself across the marble tiles. Edward stood frozen, his hand clenched at his side, his jaw trembling under the weight of silence. His authority, once unquestionable, had cracked in front of 100 watching eyes. I raised the folder higher, the brittle documents fluttering under the chandelier light like the ashes of a life long denied. "This is the man who told me art was worthless," I said evenly, my voice steady though my pulse raced. "The man who called my work failure. But these," I tapped the yellowing reviews, "are his failures, hidden away, buried beneath his demands for perfection from everyone else." Gasps rippled across the crowd. The critics who had studied my work with sharp pens now studied him. Murmurs rose, swelling into an audible tide that pressed him back where applause had once carried him forward. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes darted to Margaret, who stood pale and trembling beside him. For once, she didn't rush to cover him. She dropped her gaze, her silence and indictment louder than any defense. And then Charlotte stepped into the circle of light, her voice calm, her hand on my shoulder. "She is not the failure," she said, her tone ringing clear. "You are, for giving up, for choosing shame over persistence, for silencing her so you wouldn't hear echoes of yourself." The audience shifted, gasps turning into pointed nods, murmurs into whispers of agreement. Richard Lane stepped forward, his voice like iron tempered in fire. "Grace Whitmore's work has touched lives, children in hospitals, artists who thought they had no place, people who see themselves in her courage. That is not weakness. That is triumph." Applause erupted, not polite this time, not hesitant. It swelled, filling every corner of the gallery until it pressed against the walls, until it drowned out the last shred of Edward's hollow authority. My father stood mute, his mouth a grim line, his chest rising and falling in shallow waves. He had wielded words as weapons his entire life, but now, stripped bare before the truth, he had none left to draw. His silence was the verdict. His silence was his final defeat. I lowered the folder, closed it gently, and set it aside, as though putting away a burden I no longer had to carry. My heart pounded with something I had never felt in his presence before, not fear, not shame, but release. I turned to him, to the family, to the room that had once demanded my disappearance. My voice was clear, certain, unshaken. "I no longer need your approval. I approve of myself." The applause roared again, but I hardly heard it. For the first time in my life, I didn't need the world's noise to affirm me. His silence was enough, and in that silence I was free. The gallery lights dimmed not on defeat, but on a daughter who rose from shadows to command her own stage. What began as humiliation became revelation, and the one who tried to silence her was left speechless before the truth. Justice may come late, but when it arrives, it unmasks pride and crowns resilience. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If you found strength in this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your feelings below. Type 1 if you felt the resonance, or 2 if you think the journey still left something undone.